Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you the second part of our series here on the Battle of Waterloo, and this one will deal with the actual battle itself. If you haven't already, do make sure you've checked out our previous video. We went over the situation by 1815 in the aftermath of the Peninsular War and the initial preliminary engagements at Quatre Bras and Ligny. With that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So let's say this is the actual campaign, the actual battle we're going to focus on. While the whole 100 Days campaign is named after Waterloo, it is this part here, the actual battle, which indeed is the focus point. And so, like we said in our previous video, a lot has happened. We've had Napoleon come back from his exile at Elba. He's regained power in France. Meanwhile, Wellington is trying to form a coalition force, the Seventh Coalition, to defeat him and the French Empire once and for all. Napoleon had some initial successes and managed to do what he wanted to do. He split the British-Prussian forces up, and now was Grouchy chasing Blucher's men away, while he and Ney have gone on to face Wellington and moved on Waterloo. Wellington, as always, is a very cautious, very defensive-minded general, and has stayed on his position and set up atop of the hill, looking down over all of Waterloo, waiting for the attack. So let's see then how it will go. So first off, I just want to give a bit of an overview about Napoleon and Wellington. Now, both men by this time are considered the two finest commanders of their generation. Napoleon had made a name for himself through lots of improvisation and opportunistic attacks, right back in the 1790s at Toulon in Italy, and later on at Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. He's made many victories and a true name for himself. Wellington was a little slower to join that. He was stereotypically seen as a sepoy general because of his most of his action was done in India in the 1790s, but the Peninsular War showed he was very capable as well. He had significant successes through his defense in depth and using terrain, as he showed with the lines of Torres Vedras, but also he of course has shown great concealment and ability for offensives as well, as we saw at Salamanca and Vittoria. But what's very interesting is, despite the reputation of both these commanders, they've actually never faced each other. Despite a chance to have happened in the Peninsular War, it never actually manifested. So this Battle of Waterloo is going to be their first actual meeting directly against one another. Waterloo is going to prove each man's most famous battle, better or worse. And so it's very important we understand this battle, not just for these two commanders, as they finally managed to decide who was the best one between them, but also for understanding the wider British experience, as this indeed is the linchpin that holds the entire conflict together. It indeed is the final major battle of the wars, and indeed this era's most famous. And so before we move on, as always, let's remember who our major leaders are. We've already seen Wellington and Napoleon, but as a reminder, we have Blucher, who's leading the Prussian forces allied with Wellington. Meanwhile, Grouchy and his 30,000 force are chasing the Prussians away after the engagement at Ligny. Marshal Ney and his division is allied with Napoleon, and indeed is going to make a move on Wellington at Waterloo. As we said, Napoleon's desire has been to separate the Prussians and Anglo forces. By doing so, he's given himself a chance for clear victory. He has about 120,000 men. The Anglo-allied forces and Prussians have upwards of 250,000 when together. By splitting them up, Napoleon hopes to defeat Wellington and his army at Waterloo. Then he can focus on joining Grouchy and taking down Blucher and the Prussians. Will this happen? Well, let's find out. And so here we are. I've given you an official battle map of Waterloo. But as always, we're going to explore it using our own symbol system. You should recognize some of these from prior videos where I've used the key for our earlier battles in the Peninsular War. But if you haven't, do of course make sure you go back and check what they all mean with the infantry, cavalry, and artillery videos. Now again, very important to understand, this is just going to be my representation. It is not drawn to scale. It is not 100% accurate. So don't look at it too seriously. It's just to give you the viewers, an understanding of how the battle moves and how it shifts throughout the day, and therefore to help you understand, all being well, how the conflict actually changes and what key moments, key turning points we see happen during the conflict. So once you're ready, let us get into the actual Battle of Waterloo. And so here we are, the Battle of Waterloo. Now, the battlefield is 4 miles in length, and it has many hedges and hummocks that provide cover. And there are 3 key strong points that Wellington has set up. Now, Wellington, remember, is an absolute master of terrain and landscape in warfare. He understands the need for hills, he needs to understand the need for concealment and strategic retreats. And of course, holding and defending a position is much more easier to do than it is to, of course, attack one. So he has two freaky positions. We have the Chateau at Hougoumont, farmhouse of La Haissante, and the farm of Papelotti. And down here is Plassinois, who at the start of the battle is more or less under French control. Now, Wellington has split his forces across all three. He has about 68,000 men in these three positions, ready to face Napoleon's 70,000. With Blucher's support, he knows his army will be superior and they win the battle. He just has to hold out for Blucher to escape Grouchy's forces and get to the area. Meanwhile, Napoleon knows he has to win quickly. Time is against him right now. He has to win fast, he has to win decisively before Blucher arrives so he can focus on defeating him in the evening of the day. However, before the battle even begins, Napoleon is already facing several problems. Firstly, he woke up quite unwell, and indeed many attribute this to a potential stomach ulcer condition he was suffering with, or even, of course, the sheer exhaustion of being an older man now and having to move on campaigns so much. Secondly, his men indeed had a disadvantage in terms of terrain. They were going to have to attack uphill, giving Wellington to situate himself at the top of each one. So because of that, they were going to have a very difficult battle. His soldiers are going to be more exhausted fighting uphill, while the British and the Anglo-allies are going to be fighting downhill. And third, there had been some ferocious rain in the previous night and early morning. By now, the ground was waterlogged after the rain. There was mud everywhere. It really was very difficult to maneuver within it. Now, mud, as we established in our cavalry video, makes it very difficult for cavalry to move very fast within it. So Napoleon, against all of his instincts, rather than attacking at first light at about 5 to 6 a.m., he instead had to wait till 11 a.m. before making his attack. That's a lot of hours he lost in the day to be attacking and breaking the Anglo-allied position down, which of course buys Blucher time to arrive before the day's end. So by 11 a.m., Napoleon makes the first move and does a flanking attack at Hougoumont. His intention here is that defeat in detail, as we talked about. He wants Wellington to weaken his centre to help defend Hougoumont Farm from the incoming attack. In doing so, Napoleon knows with a weaker centre, he can then strike hard with his infantry line down the middle and therefore get a decisive advantage as Wellington troops will be all over the place and very disoriented. But Wellington is smarter than that. He's studied Napoleon's campaigns by now. He knows what Napoleon intends, and yes, while good at improvisation, what Wellington wants to do is remove chances of opportunity. And so he does that. He doesn't reinforce, despite some officers pressing and advising it. He insists no. He's going to trust his Highlanders stationed there to defend the position. And defend it they do. Napoleon, in frustration, decides to launch his second attack anyway. He starts with an artillery barrage that forces Wellington to retreat some of his men behind the hill. He does this because he knows the artillery battery relies on seeing the infantry to launch into. By removing his men line of sight of the French cannons, he therefore removes any possibility they can be accurately shot at and therefore harmed. And so we advance into the second part of the day. This is around 12 to 1 p.m. in the afternoon. The French, indeed, with their constant pressure, reached the Anglo-allied lines. Napoleon strikes hard in the centre with his infantry and trusts Ney with his cavalry to launch a flanking attack at Hougoumont Farm. Volley fire from the British line infantry repels them, and Wellington feels confident enough to launch a countercharge with his own cavalry. However, this does not go very well. They, of course, charge downhill, which initially works quite well. They're able to move faster and gain some momentum. However, there's still all that water and mud seeped at the bottom, and it's still not really dried by the early afternoon. Many of the British cavalry get stuck, and therefore they're mostly killed off in the ensuing charge from Ney's forces. And this gives Ney lots of confidence. He's already saw that many of Wellington's men have fell behind the hill earlier. He now has taken down a squadron of cavalry, even killing a few key British officers, and now feels emboldened. He feels confident that they can turn this breach into a full-on breakthrough and rout the Anglo-allied forces. But this is perhaps the biggest blunder the French commit on the day. Ney blunders right into Wellington's square formations. Now we should remember the square formations from the infantry video. Now these are compact, they're more like rectangles, but they're compact formations of infantrymen who are aiming outwards at the enemy. And what it does for horses, it feels to the horse like a wall is in front of them that they can't charge through. So what happened is Ney's men have gone over the hill, and instead of finding a scrambling Allied force, they've instead gone right into Wellington's trap. The horses run around the squares but can't break through them, and are met with constant and devastating volley fire from the British infantrymen. Napoleon is flummoxed and so frustrated with Ney. By going over the hill, he's fallen into a key tactic that Wellington hoped to use, which is something called the reverse slope defense. We saw Wellington do this in previous campaigns. He did it at Salamanca, hiding his men behind the hill, and of course he did it at Torres Vedras, conceding space to allow the French to overextend and expose themselves into his own defensive lines. By being over the hill, Napoleon's artillery can't risk firing into the position for fear of striking Ney and their own cavalrymen. So, Ney's men are just getting slaughtered and battered by the British square formations. And it ends by about 4 p.m. with a very lackluster and dishevelled repeat for Ney's forces. This is arguably a key turning point in the battle, because now instead of breaking through the British lines, they've instead had to fall back and concede space they initially had breached through in the early afternoon. And it's only going to get worse for the French as the day goes on. By 5 o'clock, Blucher and the Prussians have arrived. They managed to outrun Grouchy's forces and they've made it to Plassimois on the right flank. They get right to work and launch a very devastating attack on the position. Napoleon knows this is awful for him. Not only has he had to fall back from the front line, he now has to deal with a breach on his own rear right flank. He's now exposed on multiple positions, and he also has less men to fight with. He's lost men earlier in the day, but now Blucher, with an entire fresh 90,000 force of men, is able to come up and provide key support for Wellington at this decisive moment in the afternoon. Napoleon then decides to gamble. He decides to press the offensive and hope that he scares the Allied forces into retreating. But so he launches a full line attack with all of his infantry he has available. He even decides to deploy his old guard. And the old guard were about 3,000 men, and Napoleon had created this myth that these were the strongest, greatest warriors in all of warfare. Indeed, historically, they had had some great successes. They've been there at Italy, they've won at Jena, Austerlitz, Wagram, but that was before the retreat at Moscow. Many of the old guard Napoleon mythologized about had died or been lost in that retreat. So these 3,000 men he had left, yes, many of them were indeed veterans of those campaigns, but they were nowhere near in the high numbers that they once were. And so the British knew this, and Wellington stood firm, and he ordered his men to hold their lines shoulder to shoulder and commit to the volley fire against the attack. This was a big morale blow to Napoleon's men. And so, like that, the old guard is overwhelmed, and the infantry attack fails, and the French begin to fall back in greater numbers. Wellington and Blucher sense this weakness from the French, and so an Anglo-Prussian advance is called, and an entire attack is launched across the entire front. Wellington has been defending all day, ever since 11 a.m., right up to now at about 8 p.m. at night. They've been waiting for this moment, for the French to be weakened and to fall and break down. And now indeed they have. So they launch this attack, and Napoleon is overwhelmed. He decides himself to flee from the battle, and as he flees, the old guard form a final defense. They decide to form a rearguard action to ensure Napoleon and Ney and the others like him can escape. However, the Anglo-Prussian forces easily encircle them and wipe them out in a final attack in the day. Waterloo has ended with an Anglo-Prussian victory. Blucher proposes that they name it the Battle of the Beautiful Alliance after the great, courageous unity that was shown between the Anglo and Prussian forces. Wellington disagrees, though, given his men had done bulk of the fighting and indeed had held the position so well for several hours in the day. many more than the Prussians had fought. And so instead, the battle is now more famously called the Battle of Waterloo, after where Wellington made his stand with his army. Napoleon, meanwhile, is captured, and the war ends with a decisive Anglo-Prussian victory, and of course a wider victory for the Seventh Coalition. Reflecting on the day's events, Wellington looked out at the dreaded destruction that had happened. Again, despite this being a massive victory, thousands had died and lost their lives on this day. Wellington famously said that the only thing worse than a battle lost was indeed a battle won, reflecting on the true destruction and sorrow that had been caused by the losses on that day. But all the same, he also reflected on French tactics. He saw them as repetitive and predictable, and despite Napoleon's reputation, indeed he summarised the French had come on in the same old way, and the Anglo forces had beat them in the same old way. Perhaps indeed Wellington was the greatest commander of his generation, not Napoleon. The debate reigns, of course, and that's one we'll have in a future video. So let us summarise now the Battle of Waterloo and what exactly happened on this day. Indeed, it was a decisive victory, not just for the Anglo-Prussian forces, but of course for the wider coalition at large. Napoleon's forces were destroyed, and he was captured in prison and eventually exiled to the island of St. Helena. He would live out the rest of his days in regret and torment, and would die consumed with defeat at having never achieved the empire he once dreamed of. Meanwhile, for Wellington, he was indeed deemed a hero. The coalition war was over, and he was seen as the greatest commander who had ensured their success. And because of him, many attributed Britain becoming the hegemon of Europe all down to him. Indeed, Britain now would rule over an era known as Pax Britannica, where it was the strongest force in the world against all other powers for more or less the remainder of the 19th century. That's about 80 years where Britain is seen as the dominant force. There are going to be other conflicts in this era, but again, a lot of it where Britain is seen as the strongest nation in the world, the superpower, if you like. Many attributed that down to him, in much as the same way Nelson was deemed as securing Royal Navy's success in the 1800s. For Wellington, he indeed has cemented his legacy as one of the greatest commanders through his decisive victory over Napoleon. But we can't forget he was just one man, and we can't get stuck in the great man theory of history that he's the sole reason that the coalition forces won this war. And so that's why it's very important in our next and final video on Waterloo, we assess the reasons for victory. Was it really just Wellington, or can we actually attribute some success here to the Anglo-allied forces, to Blucher and the Prussians, and also to the French and Napoleon's own errors on the day that weakened their own position? Through looking at the tactics, through looking at the leadership, any decisions and mistakes made on the day, we can come to a conclusive answer and a thorough judgment for that topic. So do join me in our next and final video on this series, where we look into that essay question and wrap things up on the Battle of Waterloo. As always, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Your input is always appreciated throughout this series, and I do hope you're finding it very useful, not just in your studies, but also the great and interesting history. With all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.